Hello, my name's Andre, and we've been working together on this series of lessons about argumentative and discursive writing. I just want to reiterate that what we need these skills for is to persuade others of what our opinions are. So again, today, we're going to be looking at logic. And with logic, we're going to have to look at the logic which we use in language. So we're going to take logic and translate it into language. Importantly, though, in these lessons, is that effectively we're going to be looking also at common sense, because what is going to tell us about logic is our own common sense. One of the most valuable things we use in today's world is logic. And in order to construct logic, we need to look at two things today. Firstly, we're going to examine the language of logic, and then we're going to look at exactly how logic works. So what we'll look at then is the language and its structure in order to be logical, and we'll also again take a look at that common sense about which we spoke. So what you should know by the end of today's lessons is to state points of view and ideas logically. You should use good language to state your ideas clearly, and eventually we should be able to reach common sense, logical conclusions. Right, our first issue is going to be what we know as logical construction. What is a logical construction? Well, consider that you may have certain items of evidence. Say you have 3 or 4 of those, 3 or 4 different points. In order to logically construct those, we're going to take them and put them in an order which makes sense. Let's have a look at a graphic in which we look at one of these logical constructions. I've got here, for 20 years in Gauteng, it has rained during summer. My second item of evidence, if you like, is it is now the summer of 2002. To date, it has not rained yet. So those 3 together are effectively a logical construction. But we have to go one step further, and that's what we've done here. We've said, in conclusion, it will rain soon in Gauteng. We've constructed an order of events, and we put those things together in a particular common sense way to draw a conclusion. And remember, I said common sense. And here again, we have to test what we've said against common sense. So if we have a look again, I can claim that if for 20 years it has rained during summer in Gauteng, and again here it is the summer of 2002, and we know that it has not yet rained, we can presume that it's going to rain soon in Gauteng. So what we've done here is create a logical construction. But think about what would have happened if we had not concluded correctly, if we had decided in conclusion that it'll never rain again in Gauteng. Of course, that's absurd. It's peculiar to say the least. Now, if that common sense value doesn't exist in our conclusion, what we've done is mistakenly draw a conclusion and not made a logical construction. Right, so now let's recap for a minute what we've done. Have a look. Our first point, we've effectively just added to our second point, and realistically then just drawn the conclusion. It's like a maths formula. We've said 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 6. Right, do you see now that this logic follows a very mathematical pattern? We've added point to point and drawn a conclusion. We then went one step further and tested that conclusion against what we've come to understand as common sense. There remains one thing. We have to go one step further and state this in a clear, simple way. Here's an example, and a good example, of how we need to state this kind of logical sequence. If it has rained every year for 20 years during summer in Gauteng, and it is summer now, but it hasn't rained yet, then it follows logically that it will rain soon. Right, so our focus now is going to be to look at logic and how to state it clearly in language. But before we do that, I need just to look at the situations in which formal logical language is necessary. Here are a few. Logical language is used for arguments or discussions with friends or parents. It's certainly used for speeches or debates, and then it's used for assignments and essays in school or in university. And our focus here is going to be on those very formal situations. So let's look at a couple of the words, the kind of vocabulary we can use in order to look at logic or to state our logic more fully. And examples of these words are should, must, and ought. So let's look at the first word, should. We could state something along the lines of people should vote in the next election. Do you see that here? Our initial claim, that first statement we're making, uses the word should. Our second word, must. The word must is a commanding word. It's a strong word. So for example, it would be used in a sentence something like, people must understand that all chemicals don't react in the same way. And then the third word which we've used as an example, ought. Here, in a more polite, perhaps less formal situation, but still carrying the weight of a claim, we can use the word ought. People ought to take care of their own gardens in a townhouse complex, for example. The word you choose from these three very similar words will affect the force of your argument, the politeness of your argument, even how people take your persuasion. Now I want to look at a couple of words which help you to prove points. You've made the claim, you've stated your initial point, and now you're going to look at words to prove that point. Here are a few. Since, because, as, and for. You'll see that these words then link your initial point, your claim, to your conclusion. So they're the transition words, the ones which join claim to conclusion. Here is an example we could look at. Read with me. Cars should use unleaded fuel because leaded fuel makes cars slower. Here, the because. Be very aware that that because links your claim to what is technically a conclusion. There are valid reasons here. Leaded fuels makes cars slower, given for our first statement. Now let's look at the kind of language, the words, which we can use to conclude argument. Therefore, hence, thus, it follows that, one may conclude. Clearly, these words will indicate to a reader or a listener that the speaker or writer is concluding the argument. Let's have a look at one of these arguments and how these words can be used. Here's one. People want good government, our first claim. A good government listens to the people, our second claim, and then the conclusion, introduced by therefore. Therefore, people should vote for candidates who listen to the public. So you see that what we've done here is given two logical points and then the therefore to conclude the argument. Let's recap what we've done thus far in this lesson. Right, in this lesson, we've seen how an argument almost follows a mathematical formula. Secondly, we've also noticed how specific language and vocabulary is necessary to clearly state that kind of argument. What I need you to do after this lesson is to look at newspapers. The more and more you look at that kind of language in those newspapers, in news broadcasts on television, the better your vocabulary and your use of that kind of language is going to become. A second place you can look and hear this kind of language being used is in political speeches of all sorts. So the moment you see one of those being broadcast on television or hear one of those being broadcast on the radio, please make a point of listening to the language that that person uses. All that's left us now is to look at a task. But the first part of your task is to draw the logical conclusion from these three ideas. I'll read them. Birds have feathers. Feathers assist in flight. Humans are starting to grow feathers. Then select your conclusion from these options. Remember that only one of these is the logical conclusion. Here are the options. A. Birds are becoming human. B. Soon humans will be flying. C. Humans are the same as birds. And D. Birds are losing feathers because of humans. Once you have your conclusion, the next part of your task is to test it for common sense value. So that's it for today. Until next time, when we again look at some logical language and the power of logic and argument, I'll see you.